Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Stewart, and I am Chief Administrative Officer at the Kavli Institute for Theoretical Physics in Santa Barbara, California. It is my honor today to welcome Samantha O'Sullivan, who is presenting our talk for the National Society of Black Physicists Innovate Seminar Series. Today, Ms. O'Sullivan's talk will be approximately 30 minutes and presented in webinar format. This means that we will hold all questions until the end. So as you have questions that arise for you throughout the talk, please go ahead and enter those into the question and answer section in your Zoom browser. Following the talk, Ms. O'Sullivan will try to address your questions as time permits. Next up, I'd like to introduce you to Pharah Simpson, the leader of the NSBP Student Council, which is also the group responsible for creating and leading this Innovate Seminar Series. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our NSBP Innovate Seminar Series, which is a forum for NSBP members to share their research ideas and projects in a non-specialist way with a wide audience. It is 30 minutes followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. It will be recorded and then posted afterwards with the KITP and NSBP networks. Thank you so much for joining, and the Student Council is very excited to continue this series that we developed last semester and hold this space for all our NSBP members to engage with the research of their fellow NSBP members. I'd like to introduce a special guest who is actually a member of the NSBP Student Council. Sam O'Sullivan is a junior undergraduate student at Harvard University, concentrating in physics and African American studies. She currently conducts research in experimental condensed matter physics at Harvard with a focus in electron microscopy of high temperature superconductors. She recently presented her research at the 2021 APS March meeting and at NSBP's 2020 annual conference, where she won the award for Best Talk in Condensed Matter. Outside of condensed matter, Samantha is interested in plasma physics, and she will join Princeton's Plasma Physics Lab this summer to investigate tokamak edge physics. In her free time, Sam enjoys genealogy research, running, and poetry. Welcome, Sam. We're excited to have you.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present. Like Pharah said, my name is Samantha O'Sullivan, and today I'll be talking about selenium diffusion into the strontium titanate substrate in monolayer iron selenide on strontium titanate. I've listed here my collaborators who I'd like to thank for their help and efforts, as well as my funding sources. So given the relaxed nature of the talk, I thought I would start with a slide about me. I'm born and raised in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm giving this talk from. Although usually in a non-COVID-19 era, I would be at Harvard University, where I'm a junior studying physics and African American studies. I conduct my research in the Hoffman Group, and I've attached a picture of our group's annual retreat here. And you can see me in this picture. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm so excited to have this opportunity to share my research with you today. So as a bit of an outline, I'll start with an introduction to the material I study, iron selenide on strontium titanate. I'll then present the sample growth and measurement techniques as well as results, and finally present density functional theory, which we use to support our measurements. Finally, I'll present a summary of my research and allow time for questions. So I'll begin with a brief introduction to the material. Monolayer iron selenide on strontium titanate is a high temperature superconductor, which has sparked great interest in recent years due to its dramatically enhanced transition temperature of greater than 65 Kelvin. This is dramatically enhanced compared to the bulk iron selenide, which has a transition temperature around 8 Kelvin. The big question motivating research of this material has been, what is the mechanism of superconductivity enhancement? Specifically, what could be important at the interface of this material? Some previous studies have proposed two prevalent mechanisms for interfacial superconductivity enhancement. The first is phonon coupling. So here is the electronic band structure of iron selenide on strontium titanate, where the researchers locate a main band A and a replica band A prime, indicating electron-phonon coupling is present. Here they show the most prominent phonon modes, FK1 and FK2, which are the surface phonons believed to couple to the electrons in iron selenide. The second prominent mechanism proposed is superconductivity enhancement, is charge transfer. So here an experiment demonstrated band bending between the strontium titanate and iron selenide monolayer, which is known to cause charge transfer. It's proposed this charge transfer may produce a doping effect that would lead to the system's superconductivity enhancement. But in order to understand what causes these effects, various studies have attempted to image the interface. So one study here conducted in 2018 employed scanning transmission electron microscopy, or STEM for short, to produce an atomic resolution image of the interface. You can see here they've located all of the different atoms and labeled them. And the main interesting conclusion of this study was they located an extra layer, ordered layer of selenium at the interface, shown here in their STEM image, as well as in their crystal structure. So the question becomes, how might this excess selenium impact the superconductivity? Well, a separate study employed STM imaging and superconducting gap measurements to show that a decreased presence of selenium in the iron selenide increases the superconducting band gap. So as we move up the panels, you'll see the sample contains less and less selenium, and you'll see this directly correlates with a widening superconducting gap. This suggests that the extra selenium layer might be screening the phonon modes and therefore influence the superconductivity. Or additionally, the selenium dopants in the film might add hole carriers that might destroy the superconductivity. So these studies provided motivation for our study, which led to two specific questions. First, is there an extra ordered selenium layer at the interface? And I'll present our findings to you today, which conclude no, our STEM images do not reveal an extra ordered layer of selenium. However, we then dig deeper and ask, is there selenium diffusion in the strontium titanate bulk? And our electron energy loss spectroscopy, or EELS measurements for short, do detect selenium diffusion. So these are the two results I'll be presenting today. We successfully grew a monolayer of iron selenide on bulk strontium titanate, as shown here, using molecular beam epitaxy. So here the diffraction pattern of our read image shows that we had a successful monolayer growth, and our STM image shows that we have a clean, well-ordered atomic resolution monolayer and no bilayer. After growing the sample, we employ two main techniques, the first of which is scanning transmission electron microscopy. So I've inserted a graphic here that shows a pretty basic version of how STEM works. So what we start with is an electron beam, which fires a beam of electrons down through our sample, which is on the white square here. The electron beam is focused on the sample by lenses, and then it is modified by the atomic structure of the sample. And this modification of the electron beam is then imprinted using, again, focused lenses, and we're able to see an image of the material itself with atomic resolution. For example, producing an image such as this. So this is the actual STEM image that we were able to produce using our electron microscopy. Here we start with the bulk of our strontium titanate, and this animation describes the MBE growth approach, where we then deposit a monolayer of iron selenide and finally a capping layer of tellurium. So you'll note here this STEM image has atomically clear resolution, over which I will overlay a crystal so you can see exactly which atom belongs to which element. Note that we do not see an ordered layer of selenium in our STEM, which was our first research question. There's no excess selenium between the monolayer of iron selenide and the bulk of strontium titanate. However, we do note slight elongation in the titanium, in the top layer of titanium in the vertical direction. These we call tail-like structures, and you'll note that they do not exist in the second layer of the titanium dioxide layer at the top of our strontium titanate. Other studies have similarly detected these tail-like structures and believe that they may be excess selenium that the STEM image is picking up. However, to quantify exactly which element this tail-like structure may belong to, we move on to employing our second technique of electron energy loss spectroscopy. So here I presented an image of the TEM EELS system As the graphic showed on previous slides, here we have the TEM system where we fire an electron beam through our sample, which is then focused and imprinted based on the atomic resolution of our sample itself, and we're able to get our TEM image. The second half of the system is the EELS system. And the way that the EELS system works is similarly by firing an electron beam through our sample, but rather than being interested in the image the electron beam produces, we're rather interested in the amount of energy that the electron loses. So to explain a little bit more about how this works, imagine you have an electron with some fixed initial energy EI, and we are able to, in our EELS system, produce a known range of kinetic energies. So if we fire an electron with energy EI, some of these electrons will undergo inelastic scattering, which will mean they lose energy and they have their paths slightly and randomly deflected. The amount of energy that the electron loses can be detected and measured using an electron spectrometer, and we can interpret what atom was present as a result of this energy loss. So this electron with energy EI may hit the titanium atom, and as a result of the collision, knock off an inner shell electron from the titanium atom. As a result, we're able to measure exactly how much energy our initial electron lost by then capturing the electron on the other side of the sample and measuring the energy. By taking the difference between the final energy and the initial energy, we're able to measure exactly how much energy this electron lost. Now, what's key here is that when electrons lose a specific amount of energy when they interact with a specific element. So if we measure a certain amount of energy an electron loses, we're able to determine whether it collided with a titanium atom versus a carbon atom, for example. If one finds a larger than expected number of electrons that come through the material with, say, 285 electron volts less energy than when they entered the material, this is approximately the amount of energy it's required to knock off the inner shell electron from a carbon atom. So this could be evidence that there's a significant amount of carbon in our sample. With some care and looking at a wide range of energy losses, such as this curve, which is an actual data curve obtained from our EELS measurement, we're able to determine exactly which types of atoms and the number of atoms of each type that are being struck by the beam. So this energy electron loss spectroscopy technique and this data curve is essentially what we analyze to understand exactly where selenium and other elements are located in our sample. So to give it a bit of an explanation about how this analysis process works, as I explained here, we measure along a spectrum of energy loss the intensity of how many electrons lost that specific amount of energy. And you'll note that this follows a power law function with peaks at specific intensities. So if you recall in the previous slide, I explained how each element has a known amount of energy loss when it hits an electron beam of a given energy. So thus we can identify titanium, which is known to lose approximately 500 electron volts of energy, tellurium, as well as oxygen. And these are all three elements that are present in the top layers of our sample. And so by knowing exactly where these peaks are, we then use a simple power law curve as our background. If we're interested, for example, in the titanium, we'll fit this background curve and then take the difference between our measured signal and our background curve to produce a subtracted signal that is free of instrumental resolution, and we're able to analyze directly. By performing this sample across by performing this analysis across our entire sample, we can determine exactly how much titanium exists at every point in the sample, and do the same for all of the other elements. So now to present these findings in conversation with our STEM measurements. Here I've presented the STEM measurements that I showed several slides ago with the crystal structure overlaid, as well as dotted green lines representing the top layer of strontium atoms and a dotted blue line representing the top layer of titanium atoms. We can then do our EELS analysis for a specific element. So here is our EELS analysis of strontium. And you can see our x-axis is now the energy lost, and our y-axis is exactly aligned with spatial resolution of our STEM image. So the blue dotted line represents the top layer of titanium atoms, and the green dotted line again represents the top layer of strontium atoms. You'll note that the peaks in intensity here shown in a yellow color and the lower intensity regions shown in purple or black exactly correspond with where we see strontium in our STEM image. where we see these clearly defined, well-ordered layers of strontium. You'll also note we see peaks in intensity in our EELS map. Moreover, we can directly see these peaks if we conduct an integral and sum over all of the different regions in a line cut, where now our x-axis is intensity and our y-axis is again the spatial resolution. And you'll note that we see peaks in our strontium signal exactly where we see peaks where we see strontium atoms in our STM image. So by performing this analysis for all of the elements, we're able to see exactly where each element resides in our sample. The strontium element in particular is very useful as we're able to do a fit that measures the instrumental resolution due to the finite size of the electron beam we fire through. Because we don't expect any strontium atoms above this dotted green line, we know that all of the signal above this line must be instrumental resolution. And so we're able to conduct this exponential fit, which we're able to then use when analyzing the EELS signals from our other elements, as I'll present in the next few slides. So similarly, we conduct the same analysis for two elements of interest in particular, iron and selenium. So you'll note that here I've simply put our line cuts and our energy loss maps. And with our line cuts, you'll see that the iron resides well above the top layer of titanium and strontium, as we would expect in our monolayer of iron selenide. However, our selenium resides slightly lower, shifted further down with a significant amount of selenium signal below the top layer of titanium and below the top layer of strontium. You'll note that in both of these line cuts, we overlaid the black dotted line from the strontium line cut, as I showed on the previous slide. And this line is representing instrumental resolution, as I previously mentioned. So in effect, all of the selenium and iron signal to the left of this black curve, we attribute to simply being instrumental resolution, but we do find the signal to the right as significant, experimentally significant signal of iron and selenium. So as a result, moving forward, I'll be analyzing the light green shaded area between these curves, as opposed to the entire line cut itself. Now you'll remember that our second research question was, is there any selenium diffusing into the strontium titanate bulk? And this signal presents very clear evidence that there is selenium diffusion below the monolayer and several unit cells deep into the strontium titanate bulk. And this is the analysis that I'll be focusing on for the next few slides. It's important here that we have the iron signal as well in conversation with the selenium signal, because the iron signal shows it sort of preemptively answers the question, well, is the whole monolayer just shifted further down into the bulk? And the iron signal serves as a sort of control for us to be able to say, no, clearly the monolayer resides higher as indicated by the iron peak, but there's an unusual, unexpected amount of selenium shifted lower into the strontium titanate bulk. So now we'll focus in on this selenium line cut. So by directly aligning the selenium line cut with our STM image, as I presented earlier, we're able to quantify exactly how much selenium is diffusing into the strontium titanate bulk. So you'll note here I've superposed the light green shaded area from the previous instrumental resolution correction. And I've as well overlaid the blue dotted line representing the top layer of titanium and the green dotted line representing the top layer of strontium. Here we can quantify in arbitrary units the amount of excess selenium and specifically where it is located. So you'll note, as I previously mentioned, that excess selenium diffuses several unit cells deep into the strontium titanate bulk, well below the monolayer and well below even the top layer of titanium. This is strong evidence for selenium diffusion into the strontium titanate bulk. In addition to this, we're able to quantify the amount of oxygen vacancies. So we can take this one step further, and by analyzing our oxygen and titanium signals and the ratio between the two, we're able to take this ratio to be our unit of oxygen vacancies and compare it directly with our selenium diffusion. So we can quantify the oxygen vacancies at the top layer of titanium to be approximately 11%, and at the top layer of strontium to be, or at the second layer of titanium, I should say, to be approximately 5.5%. We'll also note that the selenium decay into the strontium titanate bulk, as well as the decay of the oxygen diffusion, follow a similar decay shape. And the highest concentration of selenium diffusion is also in the area of most oxygen vacancy. So this sort of suggests that it's possible the selenium is replacing oxygen vacancies in the strontium titanate bulk, and this is what's allowing for the diffusion. So this is, essentially motivates our result that selenium is able to diffuse because of oxygen vacancies. It's also important to note selenium belongs to the same chemical family as oxygen, and so this could be a reason the selenium is able to replace the oxygen vacancies, whereas the iron, which also resides in the monolayer, is not able to. After presenting our experimental findings, I'll now employ density functional theory to provide more evidence that oxygen vacancies can facilitate the selenium diffusion into the strontium titanate bulk. So I present to you here is a top view and side view of our strontium titanate and monolayer iron selenide crystal once again. However, you'll note in this crystal, we've imposed an 11% oxygen vacancies in our top layer of titanium and 5% oxygen vacancies in our second layer of titanium. And in these oxygen vacancies, we've inserted selenium. So these highlighted regions in the top view and the side view are where selenium is replacing oxygen. So here's our final relaxed structure, and you can see again the crystal as noted by the key here on the left. So in order to employ density functional theory, we ask the question, is this formation where selenium replaces oxygen, specifically at these percents, energetically favorable? So we define the formation energy of the entire process here, and we then find the experimental conditions based on the selenium partial pressure and the substrate temperature. And based on these, our experimental conditions find this is approximately in the orange region that we have realistic experimental conditions. This is along the axis of selenium's chemical potential. We then calculate whether this configuration is energetically favorable, and we find when we take into account the energies of the relaxed structure atoms and the chemical potentials of selenium, we can plot the formation energy as a function of this chemical potential corresponding to experimental parameters. And we note that our formation energy is negative under realistic conditions, which implies that the structure is indeed energetically favorable. So in summary, this supports our argument that selenium is replacing oxygen vacancies, and oxygen vacancies thus facilitate selenium diffusion, essentially supporting our measurements from STM and EELS alike. In summary, today I've presented our experimental results, which attempted to answer the questions, is there selenium diffusion into the strontium titanate bulk after we do not observe an ordered layer of selenium at the interface? And the answer to this question is yes, we do observe selenium diffusion several unit cells into our strontium titanate bulk. Moreover, the selenium diffusion is accompanied by oxygen vacancies, which we can quantify at 11% and 5.5% in the top two layers of titanium dioxide, respectively. The next steps, it's important to understand the consequences that this excess selenium in the strontium titanate bulk may have on superconductivity, which, as I presented earlier, could have the effects of doping and or phonon modes. Some next steps for this study, as I just explained, the impact on superconductivity is really the next obvious question. How might the excess selenium impact the superconductivity? Here I presented a figure as I presented in my introduction, which shows us one study that found decreased selenium presence increased the superconductivity of the material. So it would be useful for us to conduct similar measurements to understand whether our selenium diffusion is similarly impacting the material superconductivity. Another possible next step is the use of a sort of cutting edge research technique known as atom probe tomography. As you can see these images here, atom probe tomography allows you to replicate a three-dimensional image of your material and see exactly where each atom of different elements is located. So by using this technique, we would be able to see exactly where the selenium atoms are when they're diffused into the strontium titanate bulk. And this would provide us with more clarity about the structure and characterization of our interface of our material. This is a technique that we attempted in the fall of 2019, and unfortunately, we're not able to produce successful results. Although hopefully, as we return to the lab, we will be able to try this as a next step. So hopefully these two techniques in combination with the really powerful results we were able to already obtain will produce a strong image and better understanding of the high temperature superconductor monolayer iron selenide on strontium titanate. Thank you. I'll now allow time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was really great. I really enjoyed the animations. Okay, so we have 2 questions. If you have any questions, you can just go ahead and put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. So someone asked, how long did your research or experiments take in total?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would say that it was primarily in the fall of 2019, over 1 semester, that I was conducting the majority of the experiments, so maybe 5 or 6 months. And the rest of the time, which was maybe around 1.5 years, was devoted to data analysis. So the process I explained to you about fitting the EELS signals and creating line cuts and aligning the 2 measurements and all of that took the majority of the time, rather than the experiments themselves.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another question. Why do you cap the tellurium? Is iron selenium metastable?
That's a great question. So we cap the iron selenide monolayer with tellurium for the primary reason of when we're preparing the material for measurement. Especially for scanning transmission electron microscopy, as well as for atom probe tomography, we use a process called focused ion beam nanotilling, which allows us to essentially shape the material into the correct shape for measurement. And so by having this large tellurium capping layer, we're able to do that shaping without damaging the monolayer of iron selenide itself or the bulk of strontium titanate. And so the capping layer really provides that extra protection and room for us to be able to shape the monolayer and prepare for measurement.
Thank you. And then Nico is asking, could you explain a little bit more about how phonons affect superconductivity? It's a little unintuitive to me how vibrational modes would have such an important effect.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the majority of my study was understanding the structure and the characterization of the interface itself. And it's not really clear to us at this time how this may impact the superconductivity of the material, just because we haven't done any superconductivity measurements. But the one study that I sort of present on this next slide here did find that a decreased presence of selenium increased the presence of the superconductivity, which implied that the selenium could be possibly screening the phonon modes. And so decreasing the presence of the selenium would increase the superconductivity as a result. But again, it's a sort of big question to still understand of how the selenium presence might impact the superconductivity. So that's what I would say is we don't really know yet, but hopefully we could take next steps to understand that more.
Okay, great talk, Sam. For the 3D imaging, why was it unsuccessful and what makes it more difficult? Would the spatial results from the 3D imaging add more accuracy?
Yeah, that's a really great question. To answer the second part of your question first, they definitely would add more accuracy simply because the way the process works is by evaporating each atom sort of one atom at a time and then recreating that atom in a 3-dimensional image. So you're able to see exactly where every atom in the sample is. And to have that sort of resolution is just sort of incredible and would allow us to see exactly how many selenium atoms are located where in the sample, as opposed to our two-dimensional EELS analysis. And as for why it was more difficult, we ran this attempts several times, maybe 6 or 7 attempts. And what happened was the sample kept sort of like blowing up during the evaporation process. And it was really unclear to us why this was happening. It seemed as if there wasn't a very strong adhesive force between the selenium iron selenide monolayer and the strontium titanate bulk. But that is still a mystery to us because, as we know, there is a fairly strong force between the two. And so more time in the lab would allow us to do more troubleshooting. Our next step was hopefully to grow a bulk of iron selenide on top of a bulk of strontium titanate and see if that increased the cohesive force and allowed us to produce a successful measurement that didn't result in our sample blowing up, but we didn't have time to employ that technique. So that's definitely a next step we want to try. And it's also a big question of why it was unsuccessful.
Thank you. The next question is, how thick is your substrate? Would thickness affect your results?
Great question. I don't know off the top of my head how many unit cells thick our substrate is. Here I present our STM image, which only shows 5 unit cells, but we had many more than 5. I unfortunately don't have a specific number for you, but the thickness should not impact the results of our measurement because we're focused on the interface or the region between the monolayer and the bulk. So after however many unit cells, we're not really interested in the behavior of the substrate itself, and the thickness wouldn't really change our results.
Thank you. And how did your expectations of what this research would look like change as you went through the project?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that I entered it with sort of expectations of being able to complete the atom probe tomography or the 3D imaging successfully on the first try, and that would be the main result of our experiment. That was actually the initial idea, that the whole study would be based on doing 3D imaging of the substrate rather than 2D imaging. But when the atom probe tomography proved unsuccessful, these STM results and EELS results that we had, we were sort of surprised by how great the atomic resolution was, and we realized that they could be a main result of our study instead. So we shifted focus and focused more on analyzing the STM and EELS results, and sort of put the atom probe tomography on the back burner, although we still did try numerous attempts and it kept blowing up. But it ended up changing somewhat significantly the research process. And I would also say that the data analysis was much more time consuming than I expected. I sometimes felt like I was doing a lot more programming than experiment, but I think a lot of experimentalists will say that that's sometimes true. And so those were the main ways that the process ended differently than I expected it to.
I actually have a question. I'm not sure if you mentioned, but which software did you use for the modeling?
Mm-hmm. So we did all this analysis in Python. So a lot of it was just, image processing and like I showed on the EELS, even to produce, let me go back to the slide, sort of the EELS color maps that you see. We were able to produce these just in Python using integrating and overlaying the crystal structure and a lot of alignment coding as well.
Okay. Thank you. Could you possibly use a different substrate that has a similar structure?
That's a good question. I haven't researched any other substrates. It's well known that monolayer iron selenide on strontium titanate is a high temperature superconductor. So it's possible, but I don't know much about any other substrates that would also have the same transition temperature.
What has been the most enjoyable part of this research process?
I would say that I think it's been learning as much as I've learned about the entire process. So I really enjoyed being in the lab doing experiments, and I also enjoyed learning so much coding as I did my data analysis. And now in our final stage of sort of writing and preparing for publication, I've also enjoyed doing research on literature review and learning about the editing process, which can be very lengthy, and even making figures. So although each step has its tedious parts, I think learning the most about the whole process has been really enjoyable.
Okay, and I have one last question. So you showed like the plot of the formation energy on page 17. What sources of error did you have in finding the formation energy, and are there other methods that you could have used?
Yeah, great question. So I'm not sure if it's necessarily a source of error, but it heavily does depend on this value of the chemical potential of selenium. And this is a value that was not easily, we couldn't find it easily in literature. And so rather we sort of relied on other previous calculations and some estimations to determine this chemical potential of selenium. And so I would say that the fact that we're kind of plotting against experimental conditions, and here I've shown our realistic experimental conditions, there's likely, some wiggle room in those values. But I would say that those are the sort of the primary ways that you could change this formation energy a little bit.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam. I'm going to wait to see if there are any more questions. Going once, going twice. Oh, there is a question in the chat. What are superconductors' potential application to society, and what is the importance of the work?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, so superconductors have very powerful applications. Some of my favorite are they can produce more powerful MRI machines. Their sort of magnetic levitating trains are possible when you have superconductors, which can produce very strong magnetic fields, and also fusion energy. So tokamak reactors, which produce fusion energy. One big application is they require sort of a room temperature superconductor to decrease the amount of energy that you need to put in to produce the fusion reaction. So if we were able to engineer a room temperature superconductor, it could make efficient fusion energy a real possibility. So it's really exciting to be studying high temperature superconductors, because as we find higher and higher transition temperatures, we're just moving sort of one step closer to engineering a room temperature superconductor.
And I know like a lot of scientists are in the room, and superconductors are super important in a lot of our research, like me personally, because I'm in experimental high energy physics, so lots of applications. Okay, thank you so much, Sam. That was great. It's always so nice to have you talk. Someone said, I just want to highlight that this was a super interesting talk. Thank you so much for making what can be a difficult topic more digestible. I agree. It was so easy to follow, and I really enjoyed the graphics and the animation, and it was just very interesting. So thank you so much. We're so happy to have you. Thank you everyone for attending. We will see you next month at our next talk.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.